dear students, and welcome once again to the session on whiskey. In the previous whiskey session, which was whiskey part 1, we discussed about the definition of whiskey, how the whiskey is manufactured. Now, in today's session, we will talk about different types of whiskeys. Some special countries to mention. We will talk in details about the Scotch whiskies, Irish whiskies, American whiskies, and Canadian whiskies. Well, Scotch whiskey is regarded as the world's finest whiskey. But let's see first, in general, what are the different types of whiskies. The first is a malt whiskey, which is made from malted barley. The second type is a grain whiskey made from any type of grains. If single grain is used, then it is usually aged for a longer time. A blended malt whiskey is a mixture of single malt whiskies from different distilleries. If a whiskey is labeled pure malt or just malt, it is almost certain a blended malt whiskey. This was formerly called a vatted malt whiskey. Blended whiskey. These are typically made from a mixture of malt and grain whiskies. A whiskey simply described as a Scotch, Irish, or Canadian whiskey is most likely a blended whiskey. A blend typically contains whiskey from many distilleries so that the blender can produce a flavor consistent with a particular brand. Cask strength, also known as barrel proof. Whiskies are rare and are usually only the very best whiskies are bottled in this type of way. They are bottled from cask, undiluted or only lightly diluted. Single cask, also known as single barrel. These whiskies are usually bottled by specialist independent bottlers. Each bottle of a single barrel whiskey is from an individual cask, and often the bottles are labeled with specific barrel and bottle numbers. The taste of these whiskies may vary substantially from cask to cask within a brand. Let's see different types of Scotch whiskies. The first one to start with, single malt whiskey. This is whiskey from a single distillery made from a mash that uses only one particular malted grain. Examples: Glenfiddich, Glenlivet, Highland Park, Macallan, etc. Second type of Scotch whiskey is vat malt. It is a blend of malt whiskies from different distilleries of Scotland. It is also called as pure malt. Blended whiskey. It is a blend of malt and grain whiskey. Examples: Johnnie Walker Black Label, Devars, J&B Rare, Chivas Regal, Cutty Sark, VAT 69. Single grain whiskey. It is a grain whiskey from a single distillery, usually aged for a long time. Example: Cameron Brig. Different types of Irish whiskey. Irish usually spell whiskey as W-H-I-S-K-E-Y, whiskey. Irish whiskey is distilled in Ireland from a wash of malted and unmalted barley with some grain. The traditional Irish whiskey is unblended. The first type of Irish whiskey is pure pot still whiskey. It is traditionally made from a mixture of malted and unmalted barley distilled in a pot still. That's why the name pure pot still whiskey. The second type is a single malt whiskey. It is distilled in pot still from 100% of malted barley. Example: Jameson Bushmills, Paddy, etc. Types of US whiskey. All American whiskies are made from cereals, generally a mixture of various grains of cereals, distilled mostly in patent still at no more than 90% and aged in oak barrels and bottled at not less than 40% alcohol by volume. The first one is bourbon whiskey. It is named after the county Bourbon in Kentucky. It is made from alcoholic wash of corn, rye, wheat, and malted barley. Most bourbon are aged for at least 6 years. The charred barrels contribute special flavors to the whiskies. Examples of bourbon are Jim Beam, Four Roses, Old Crow. What is a Tennessee whiskey? It is made from sour mash of mixture of grain consisting of minimum 51% corn distilled in Tennessee and aged in charred oak barrel for around 2 years. Most Tennessee are made from mash of corn, rye, and malted barley in a proportion of 80%, 10%, and 10%. The most popular Tennessee whiskey example is Jack Daniels. A corn whiskey. It is distilled from a mash of minimum 80% corn. It may be or not be aged. Example, mellow corn. Rye whiskey. It is distilled from a mash consisting of at least 51% rye and aged in charred new oak barrels for at least 2 years. Example, Wild Turkey, Jim Beam, rye. Different types of Canadian whiskey. These whiskies are often referred to as rye whiskey. Canadian whiskey should be aged for minimum of 3 years. Example of Canadian whiskies: Canadian 83, Crown Royal, Canadian Club. Some brands of whiskies. Well, it's time for quiz now. The link for the quiz is given in the description box below. We will continue this session with service of whiskey, which you will see in Whiskey Part 3. Hope the quiz was simple. Thank you.